Minister of Justice, do you have any idea what I could do to you?
Really? You gonna try and talk tough standing there in your red underwear? You have 10 words. 10 words to explain to me why you, the Minister of Justice, would want your fiancée killed by the Yakuza. Now, if I don't like what you say, you are going through that fucking window.
You don't have the faintest idea what's going on.
How many words was that?
9.
9. You have 1 word left. Really?
Shingen!
Keep going.
Since he got sick, old man Yoshida spent billions on doctors, healers, stockpiling adamantium at his lab in the north, secretly trying to prolong his life. He brought the company to the edge of bankruptcy. He was obsessed with you.
English!
Shingen lied, protected the old man, concealed the debt from stockholders in the board. He tried to be a good son and thought he'd be rewarded.
And then the old man left everything to his granddaughter.
Mariko got all the power. She would dump his ass.
It's true. Mariko would have never gone through with the wedding. Not once the will was revealed. She never took to me.
Oh, really? Class act like you.
Shingen promised me a fortune for my help.
So you put a hit on his daughter. Is that it?
Political careers don't last forever.
That's right.
Wait! No! You wanted the truth! I told you the truth!
I didn't like it.
Oh. How did you know there's a pool down there?
I didn't.
Welcome to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. I'm your host, Perry Constantine, and we are kind of doing a wrap-up of some Wolverine stuff. About a month ago, we finished Deadpool and Wolverine, and we also talked about X-Men Origins Wolverine, and now we are going to be wrapping all that up with a discussion of the Wolverine. And for that, I have a new guest here, and that is Travis James. Travis, how you doing today?
I am doing all right, staying warm despite the soon-to-be minus 50 weather here and where I'm at in Canada. But
well, we got a Canadian who has lived in Japan before, so you're definitely the right person to come on for this episode.
oh, I didn't know you were
Before...
Canadian.
No, you are.
Well, I'm Canadian. I haven't lived in Japan, but I've studied.
Oh, okay. I thought you had lived here as well. Okay. All right. So then we have a Canadian and we have someone who lives in Japan. So we've got all bases covered for this movie. But before we get too much into that, why don't you tell people a little bit about yourself?
As Perry said, as you said, my name is Travis James. I am Canadian. Je suis Canadien. Je parle français. 私は日本語少しわかります. So I do understand a bit of Japanese as well. Yeah, I've been a huge comic nerd my entire life. I mean, pretty much as far back as I can remember, to be honest. And over the last year, been diving into an old childhood dream, trying to get back into actually drawing and hopefully get an inking credit out there someday. So yeah.
Okay, very cool. So let's talk a little bit about the what got you into comics then. What was it that kind of got, if you remember what it was that got you started? Because I know you said for as long as you can remember.
Yeah. In terms of like comics themselves, like actual physical comics, and some of my earliest memories of them, lived in a small town outside one of the cities here, and as a kid would go with my old man into town to gas up the truck and whatnot, and the gas station had one of those spinning racks of comics, and whatever was on there is what you got. And the ones that got me hooked, it was actually I don't know if you remember when Marvel was publishing this title, but X-Men Classics.
Yes.
When they were doing reprints of the old Chris Claremont line from the 70s into the 80s, I think it was. And so I mean my first memories are, Shadowcat, Nightcrawler, Storm with the Mohawk, Colossus, Wolverine, that whole era. So, when I saw the cartoon when it came out on Fox as a kid, and I saw Wolverine wearing blue and yellow, I remember thinking, well, this is weird. That's not his costume. Because the first thing I saw was the old John Byrne brown and orange, right?
I had the exact same thought actually, because my first, and I've told the story before, but my first exposure to the X-Men was through that first line of figures that Toy Biz did back in the early '90s, and that had the brown and gold costume. So when the cartoon came out and I saw him in blue and yellow, I was kind of surprised at first. I'm like, oh, I guess that's the same guy, but his costume looks really different. And then also, and my assumption for a long time was that the brown and gold was his first costume and the blue and yellow was an update, because then I saw Pride of the X-Men, which I know came out before, and he had the brown and gold in that. When he was on, I think it was Spider-Man and His Amazing Friends, I think he also had the brown and gold in that as well. And
Yep.
then it wasn't until years later when I actually went back and I read the original X-Men comic, Giant Size X-Men. I saw at first my first exposure to that was through like back in the '90s, they had like these children's novelizations of some big X-Men comic book stories. So they had like Giant Size X-Men, some other stuff, and he had the blue and yellow in that cover, and they also had Cyclops with his modern '90s costume as well. So I figured that was just something
Right.
they did for those covers. But then when I read the actual comic, I'm like, oh, so the blue and yellow was his first costume. So I was very confused as a kid with that myself.
Yeah, it's funny. I hadn't thought about those figures you're talking about in years, and I remember the Wolverine one was a little lever on the back to make the claws pop out. You couldn't even like twist the arms or anything. It was just like a straight solid piece sticking out so that the claws could. Oh man, I haven't thought about those in years. You're making me feel old, man.
Yeah, and it had the little switches on the back of each of the arms, and the claws were
Yep.
just like one big clump together with like some like line separations in it, but they weren't actually separate claws. And then the and his
The
mask would come off, and it
Magneto.
was like a ring.
Yeah, right. Like a yes, I remember that. And the Magneto, I remember, didn't have again just completely stiff-armed, and all it had was this little thing with I guess he had a magnet embedded in his chest, and you could just stick a
Yeah,
piece to
yeah,
his chest.
yeah. I remember those, and I think the Storm one had like a light up lightning bolt symbol on her chest or something like that, and
Yeah, and
Cyclops
there was
had
a
light up eyes. I think, yeah,
right. He had the lever in the small of his back. He'd flick, and it would go on. That thing was
yeah.
actually pretty bright for a toy back
It
then,
was,
and it
yeah,
lasted
and I
a long
remember,
time.
and I think Nightcrawler had like suction cups on one of his knees and one of his hands.
I could never find Nightcrawler. I always wanted to get Nightcrawler, but I could never find him.
See, that was one that I didn't get that first figure of. I got some of the later Nightcrawler figures though that were a little bit more detailed, a little bit nicer. Um, so you came in through the X-Men and just kind of have you mostly stayed like in the X-Men stuff? Have you branched out into other stuff?
I, I have branched out into other stuff. The other ones that really got me were Spider-Man. Seems I'm drawn to the misfit characters. Something about Spider-Man, he's always been, X-Men's always been my favorite team, but Spider-Man's always been my favorite. And I remember as a kid, I had my dad doing comic book polls because he did work in the city. So once a month he would go in and he would pick up for me Amazing Spider-Man, Spectacular Spider-Man, Sensational Spider-Man, Peter Parker Spider-Man, and then Wolverine and Alpha Flight because I got real hooked on Alpha Flight as well. I remember going uh, bribing my grandmother to with chores to help her with chores, and then she would take me in. There was the one comic book store in the one end of the city that had the quarter bins upstairs, and I remember rifling through them for hours trying to find as many consecutive issues of Alpha Flight as I could. And by the end of it, I had almost the entire first run of Alpha Flight, and I got really excited when the volume 2 came out. What was that, 97? I want to say
96, 97, something like, yeah, the Steve Siegel one, yeah.
no, no, I think it was 97 to 99. But I remember
Okay.
really liking Heather's green costume when she started going by Vindicator again. That was a good run for me. So yeah, I mean, the Claremont stuff, obviously for X-Men, with the John Byrne art, the JMS Spider-Man, any of the Spider-Man art by. I know so many people love McFarlane's run, but man, the John Romita Jr. Spider-Man for me is just he's one of the few guys that would just draw him rangy and skinny and lanky, and that's what you expect him to be when you think Peter Parker. You don't think some uber buffed, super jacked kind of, well, yeah, like McFarlane's art. Like, don't get me wrong, some of the things McFarlane did I absolutely love. I mean, the whole bringing in that spaghetti webbing where there's just always the extra webbing. Because yeah, what is going to happen to it? It's not just going to disappear, right? So that made sense visually, and I loved it. But something about that raw, sketchy style that John Romita Jr. has, that's always been my favorite. And everything I tried to draw as a kid, I tried to mimic it, but there's a reason everybody has their own style. It's hard.
So, what got you into why did you start getting into art and all that kind of stuff lately?
Uh, kind of by accident, actually. I stopped drawing after high school, which 20 plus years ago, because life and bills and rent and girls and everything else that distracts you. And started a few years ago more as just a hobby. My wife had picked herself up an iPad with an Apple Pencil, and I started poking around with it. Then she got mad because I'd be constantly stealing it, and ended up having to get my own, and just kept doing it as a hobby. One or two pieces a month, just poking around. Custom D&D characters for buddies of mine, or reteaching myself how to draw or whatever. But the one thing I fell really in love with was February of last year. Gail Simone reposted rather, pencils from an artist from Spawn, and I can't remember who it was offhand, but it was a cover that he did, and it was all in the blue line. Absolutely gorgeous piece, just tons and tons of detail. And I'd finished whatever book I was reading at the time, and had no new games or anything out that I was wanting to play. So I'm like, you know what, I'll try inking it on the iPad just for something to do, and I got hooked. I don't know what it is, but just something about seeing that page just fill up with that ink, whether it's physical or digital, just watching it fill the page and really make the pencils pop, and watching that definition just appear. It's really, really relaxing, really like almost meditative. And I just fell in love with it, and I've just been inking and inking and inking and inking constantly since. So yeah, I had a buddy that I game with that has written for Marvel and others, that's been encouraging me the last few years, trying to give me an idea what the industry's like, from somebody that's been at it a long time, and telling me I should be making a go of it. And I took it seriously, but I didn't take it really, really seriously, because I'm like, well, he's a buddy. We've been gaming together a few years. Just, he's being nice. Was kind of the way I looked at it. But eventually I worked up the courage, got a basic portfolio together, and reached out to a couple of working artists just to say, hey, am I completely out to left field here, or is there actually something there? And I was told, no, there is promise there. There's things you need to work on, obviously. Not drawing for 20 years definitely hurt. But feedback has been good. Sometimes pretty brutal, but not coming from a place of trying to be mean or anything or discourage me, but more like, work on this and it will get even better. And some of the more brutal feedback that I got was actually about 2 or 3 months ago, at our local Comic Con here. There was an artist I walked up to, and I'm not going to say his name, but in hindsight, it was either one of the most ballsy or one of the most stupid things I've ever done, because I stopped reading comics so long ago, other than like, if I got my hands on a copy of like one of the omnibuses, like Civil War, like combining that whole thing there, or Spider-Verse, or whatever it was. So a lot of the more modern artists and writers over the last 10, 15 years, I had no idea who they were. And so I walked up to this fella, and he's done a lot. And he actually took good 15 minutes out of his day, at least. Took the iPad from me and just like zoomed in, like really, really zoomed in on all the detail, and some really crushing feedback, but it was needed. And I've got it all written down. He even took out he asked when the last time I picked up an actual quill and a brush was, and he said I need to get back to it, because the better I get with that, the better the digital is going to look as well. And he was absolutely right. Absolutely, completely right. He took a page out of a sketchbook he's got, whipped out some lines with a brush for me, saying, practice these lines, replicate these lines over and over and over and over again. This is your foundation. And I've just been at it since. I went and had a couple dozen 11 by 17s printed out of just various pencils from various artists, and went on Amazon, ordered a a whack load of brushes, probably too many now, come to think of it. But it's pretty much what I do all day when I'm not working. So yeah, I mean, yeah, feedback's been good, and honestly, it's just enjoyable. Like I said, it's something about just watching that page fill up and seeing those lines appear is just mesmerizing. I don't know. It's
No, I know
addictive.
what you mean. Yeah, yeah. I got into art during COVID, and we started having lockdowns and stuff, and there were some sales on Udemy, so I picked up some art courses,
Nice.
dove into it, and got myself a first starting off on just, sketchbooks and pencils, and then deciding to go ahead and spring for a tablet. And it's been very nice. Holding up a very cool, very cool. He's holding up a page of inks that he's done there. And
Yeah.
and yeah, mostly I was just focused on my own stuff. And but about I think it was about like maybe 2 years ago, a buddy of mine, Eric Johns, who he worked on me with, we worked on a comic together actually last year.
Nice.
And he he was trying to get back into art, and he was like posting up these sketches he had done on Facebook, and just like, he's trying to do like, a sketch a day type of thing, or one of those types of challenges. So, and I really like the pencils, and there was just something that really kind of spoke to me, and I'm like, do you mind if I, go ahead and, save these and ink them? And he's like, yeah, go ahead. So I did that, and I was just kind of like, playing around with it and inking them and coloring them. And yeah, I do that from time to time. I'll like find something, a pencil piece or something online, and I'll think like, oh, I want to try my hand at inking and coloring this myself. And yeah, you're right. There is something that is just kind of like meditative, because there are times when I feel like doing something art related, but I don't feel like starting a new piece from scratch. So just like, inking and coloring someone else's work is just kind of like a nice way to exercise those muscles. And there is kind of like a meditative aspect to it, I think, as well. I agree with you on that.
Yeah, and it's neat too because it is an art in and of itself. I mean, I know obviously people that don't know comics and don't know the industry, they're like, oh, so you're just tracing it. Well, yeah, but there's a lot more to it than just that because it's, worrying about the line weights and making sure that you're really capturing what they're trying to do with the original pencils, not just add to it and not just outline it, like really give that feeling to it. And it's funny. I had this realization that a lot of people go into the comics industry and they go in and they want to be a penciler or they want to be a colorist. And the buddy of mine that I game with said, yeah, not a lot of people go into the industry wanting to be inkers. And I had the realization that inkers are pretty much the basis of the comics industry, rather than the lead guitar or the vocals. You still need them, but they don't usually get all the credit.
No, it's the same thing with, I do lettering too. And so
Okay.
it is that was actually how I got my first comic writing credit, was because I got in through lettering. And so, I was lettering some stuff for AC Comics, and I asked them one point, I'm like, I'm a writer too. Would you be? And they said, okay, well, there's this story that we only had one chapter finished of, and the guy just disappeared. Do you want to finish the story? I'm like, okay, sure. So I just went through and finished off the rest of the story, and that was like my first comics writing credit there. And yeah, there was something. It was something I started out of necessity, because I was working on a comic with someone, and at that point, most of the people in the indie sphere were, when you were getting an artist, it was someone who was like a triple threat. They could do or quadruple threat. They could do the art, they could do the pencils, and they could also do lettering as well. And this guy couldn't do the lettering, so I'm like, okay, well, let me try my hand at it. I've got a copy of Adobe Illustrator. I dove into some tutorials, and then just kept working on it, and got a bunch of, most of my comics work because of that has been lettering, actually.
That's awesome. I mean, it's as a kid when I was drawing, I really wanted to get into it, and we had the first sort of idea that I could do it. There was I cannot remember his name for the life of me now, but he's from a small town originally, very nearby where I live, maybe about an hour, 2 hours drive, called Portage la Prairie. And he used to write in the '90s. He was one of the writers on X-Man. And I was doing my weekend job working in the mall, and on my lunch break in the food court, just I think I was, if I remember correctly, I was inking a John Romita Jr. Spider-Man that I had used as reference and replicated in my sketchbook, and he sat down and talked to me for a little bit. There used to be in the city here a company called Digital Chameleon, They've been gone for decades now, but they were, if I recall correctly, they did a lot of the coloring and lettering for multiple different titles between Marvel and DC and Image back at the time. So my goal was always try to, work for them. But once they went away, I think that's also part of where the dream back then died, right? The internet was still in its infancy. It wasn't like now where you've got pencilers and inkers and colorists from literally all over the world working on titles all the time, plus the incredible amount of resources out there for independent creators to get their own stuff out there, things like, webtoons and whatnot. That wasn't a thing back then. And so I think that might have been part of why the bug sort of died way back when.
No, yeah, I definitely remember that aspect too. Like when I was starting to get into it, there were things like digital webbing, and it was kind of like the nascent internet back then, but they didn't have nothing like they have now with Kickstarter and all that, and webtoons and all that kind of stuff. Anyway, very interesting stuff. But let's move into what I like to talk about is what kind of stuff are you interested in lately? Anything that's been grabbing your attention these days?
Yeah, so it's kind of funny. I have been on a bit of a, I guess, comics pilgrimage almost is maybe the best way to explain it. I decided for whatever reason last year I was going to resubscribe to Marvel Unlimited and just read. Normally I'll read, 50 plus books a year as it is, like novels. But I decided I was going to start with Uncanny X-Men #1 from 1963, and I was going to read through everything on Marvel Unlimited chronologically for the X-Men. And I mean every side title, every individual title, the one-offs. So, X-Force, X-Factor, Excalibur, Wolverine, limited runs on Rogue or Nightcrawler or whatever. And as each title came out, New Mutants, of course, as each title came out, I sort of add them to the reading list. And so I'll read all the titles that were published in that particular month for all of them. So from probably about January last year to about now, I'm up to about 2012 or so. So I've been on a massive binge, and it's really the struggle with it is as I'm getting really back into comics, hearing about all these awesome storylines that I really want to just skip ahead and read, but I'm exercising self-control and so funny one. The other day I was messing around on the new drawing tablet I picked up, and I was starting to do the framework for a Spider-Man drawing, right? Just the usual like bendy pretzel kind of Spider-Man pose, and it struck me that you can pretty much take any Spider-Man pose or any Nightcrawler pose and just use them interchangeably. And then my brain went down this whole what if rabbit hole of Spider-Verse with, what if Nightcrawler was bitten by the spider instead. And then about 2 hours later, after having this idea that I thought was just great, somebody's like, "Oh man, did you read Uncanny Spider-Man?" I'm like, "Wait, what?" And then I found out found out that it had already been done 2 years ago. So I'm really excited to get to the point and read that storyline because I think that's great. I mean, Kurt is one of my favorite characters in X-Men, period. So I'm super excited to read that. I really want to get to the Krakoa era, and I know you've mentioned it multiple times on previous episodes, and I keep hearing all my buddies talking about it, and X of Swords and everything, and like so many things that I want to read, and I'm I'm trying to restrain myself and just keep reading them in order.
There's some good stuff in there too. Like I know, I know some people, go back and forth about that era, like really like the post Morrison, pre Hickman era. Like it's kind of like it's a mixed bag for a lot of people. There's some good stuff in there. There's some stuff that people don't really like. It can be kind of divisive here and there. But there's a lot of good stuff in there though that you have to look forward to. So 2012, refresh my memory. Whereabouts is that happening? Like what like kind of
So
stuff is happening
2012
then?
is the big split between Scott and Logan, where
Oh,
Logan
the
goes up
schism,
to
yeah.
Westchester and restarts the school. Meanwhile, Scott's staying war general over on Utopia there. So it's been good. I will say some of the side stuff that I got into because of it, I really enjoyed. New Excalibur, loved that. Probably one of my favorite runs that I come across through my whole journey. That 2005 run there, where you really start to see Kane Marco start to have a heart, right? The way he supports Talia after her stroke, like that. I loved that storyline. That page that I held up to show you earlier that I was inking is actually one of those pages from issue 17, where she's in the hospital and going through physio and rehab and everything after stroking out in the middle of a superhero fight. So there's that I really enjoyed. Really loved going through the Exiles. Great series. I mean, it's you never know what you're going to come across as you get from issue to issue, and it actually really reminded me. I mean, it makes sense that it reminded me of it, but it really reminded me of the old Excalibur run when they had Widget and they were bouncing around from dimension to dimension to dimension, and the Exiles really had that same sort of feel to it. So it's neat, and I think the best part though of doing this big run is coming across issues that I had as a kid that were always like the one-offs that I had, and I never knew how the story finished. And actually finally getting to see how all these different stories and events finished and how you got there from everything that was going on. I think it's been one of the greatest parts of going through this sort of binge.
That's cool. Yeah, I remember that too when I was first getting into comics, and I've been reading pretty much continuously since I finally got into them. So, but like, I remember back at the time, like going back and then rereading old stuff and then finding out like, oh, so that's how that happened and everything. That's how that got into this part. So yeah, that's definitely an interesting thing there. So for my part, what I've been interested in is I don't get a lot of time to play games these days just because I've got two kids, and anytime I dare to change the TV, my daughter throws a fit. So
I remember
um
those days.
so yeah, it can be tough to find time to game, but every now and then I've been able to, and I've been playing Ghostwire Tokyo on the PS5,
Okay.
which has been a lot of fun because it's, like you said, I live in Japan, so there's that aspect of it. So it's got a lot of like the Japanese culture stuff I like, and also I'm an urban fantasy author too, so like it's also kind of like got an urban fantasy horror feel to it. So it's been really fun to like kind of dive in, and mostly I don't really like first person type games, but this has been one of the exceptions where the gameplay and the story are both interesting enough where I'm able to put aside my first person bias, and it's been good. It's been a lot of fun.
Yeah, you're talking urban fantasy there, and you just clicked in a reminder for me to go and check when the next Dresden Files book comes out by Jim Butcher.
But anyway, we are going to take a quick break, and then when we come back, we will talk about the Wolverine. Ever have a situation where you want to watch something on Netflix, but it's only available in a different country? Or are there websites you want to access, but they're blocked in your location? What you need is a VPN, or a virtual private network. A VPN is effectively your own superhero mask to protect your device's secret identity from the internet. Your IP address and all your data are encrypted, allowing you to browse the internet safely and securely. In these uncertain times, protecting what you do on the internet is more important than ever. But free VPNs available out there are not as secure as they claim, so you need a trusted service like ExpressVPN. I've been a loyal user of ExpressVPN for years. They offer the easiest experience, the fastest speeds, and the most responsive customer service I've ever dealt with. But the best part of ExpressVPN is that you can choose the country you're accessing the internet from, which lets you get around geo-blocking. So if you want to watch something that's only available on Netflix UK, you set your location in the UK, and then you watch as much as you like. If you'd like to try out ExpressVPN, you can get 60 days of free usage by signing up using my referral link in the podcast description. Just click the link in the description to get started. And we are back with Travis James, and we are about to discuss the Wolverine, which is the 2013 film, second solo Wolverine movie, not technically a sequel to X-Men Origins Wolverine for various reasons, which people who listen
We
to the
won't
X-Men
talk about
Origins
that.
episode, yeah, we already did that episode. So people who remember that episode will understand the reasons why it's kind of a good thing.
I look at X-Men Origins Wolverine sort of the same way that you would look at Highlander 2. We just
Yeah.
pretend it never happened.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And even the Fox people, they decided it never happened as well after Days of Future Past, which I don't know how that actually works in terms of the timeline and all that, but however it works, they managed to fix things up with that in various ways. And so this one they decided they were gonna, it was kind of set up in X-Men Origins, because there is a post-credit scene where Logan's in Japan and he talks about how the bartender asks if he's drinking to forget, and he says he's drinking to remember. And so Gavin Hood, who had directed that movie, he had said that there would be a sequel set in Japan. And Jackman as well talked about how he really wanted to do an adaptation of the classic Chris Claremont, Frank Miller Wolverine miniseries, which of course was set in Japan. And this is what we got for it. Finally, we ended up getting it. And before we dive too much into that aspect of it in this movie in particular, what are kind of your thoughts about Wolverine? Have you been a fan of that classic miniseries, all that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so it's one of those things that I did really get to finally read during my my binge here that I've been on recently, and as a kid, obviously I couldn't find most of them, but there were so many aspects of it that were constantly hinted at through various other storylines or later events, and really getting to sit down and read it and enjoy it. It's funny because it actually made me completely change the way I look at the movie, The Wolverine itself. Just noting some of the major differences, that it got to the point where I'm watching it through several times over the last couple weeks here, to get ready for tonight. And a lot of the notes that I took are more on, well, this is interesting that they changed this, and I can see why they did it, but there's other things that were changed that maybe didn't work quite as well. I mean, Wolverine's connection to Japan has always been a big part of his character, whether the aspects that he took from Japanese culture or that he was given by the writers from Japanese culture were accurate or not is a is a different story, which you've talked about before. But they've still, for better or worse, have been sort of defining traits for his character from the bits of his life that he could remember before he got all his memories back after, was it M-Day, I think, right? When they got back and he could remember everything.
I believe so,
Um,
yeah.
so it's been kind of neat to go through because I obviously enjoyed the movie before. I mean, growing up reading X-Men comics, anytime we get to see our favorite characters on screen is always is a good thing, usually. Um, but I think I've got a better appreciation for the movie now, and those aspects of his character and his storyline that I wouldn't have had if I hadn't gone on that recent binge.
Yeah, you know what? It's funny when I think about this storyline. I'd mentioned those like children's novelizations that I read as a kid, and that Wolverine miniseries was actually one of those, because that was the first time I read about the story of like him going up against Shingen and all that. And obviously, it was a very sanitized version since it was a kid's novelization. Um, and this is one of those weird stories where you're when you're a comics fan for a long time, you kind of absorb a lot of stuff just through osmosis, reading these stories. And it was several years ago now when I was getting really into comiXology and buying stuff off that they had on the various sales, that I picked up that Claremont Miller trade, and I read it and I realized, oh my god, this is actually the first time I'm reading the story. I know all of it because I've read that novelization, I've absorbed other stuff of it through osmosis, but I never actually sat down and read that story until a few years ago, and it was actually a few years after I saw the movie. So it's really interesting how, watching the movie, I knew all the departures from the story that they had taken, but I had never actually read that original comic book. So it was kind of funny to, when I thought about it, that I actually hadn't read that yet, and then finally getting a chance to sit down and read it.
I mean, yeah, there's so much that has been covered over the last. I mean, especially reading as many issues as I have over the last 10, 12 months. So many storylines that have been covered, and so many ways that they tie in, and events from the different carriers that tie, different titles rather, that tie in, and characters that tie in, and just the sheer amount of things that Wolverine has been involved in. Obviously, due to his popularity with the fan base, but yeah, it's when you actually stop and try to think. I mean, it's explaining his history is almost as complicated as about a month ago I was trying to explain to my 14-year-old son the Summers family tree. So it's right up there with that, just trying to piece together all the bits of Wolverine's history, and I do love that they've been able to do as many movies with Hugh Jackman as they have and try to fit in as much as they have. I mean, for obvious reasons, timeline wise and movie continuity and mass marketing to people that aren't lifelong fans like us. Yeah, some changes had to be made, but I think I'd rather have what we have than have not gotten anything at all over the last 20 years.
Yeah, yeah, I've got mixed opinions on what I call the Foxverse films, and there's definitely some good stuff, and I think Hugh Jackman is definitely one of the highest points, if not the highest point, of those films, and the movies have been very hit or miss, though, especially when you look at them just on their own merits. If you divorce yourself from the X-Men fandom, there's still aspects where I think they could have executed things a little bit better, but we've talked about that in various episodes when we've covered those different movies.
Oh, for sure.
Now this movie, I remember because this was the summer of 2013, and there were three big superhero movies that summer. This was Iron Man 3, it was Man of Steel, and it was the Wolverine. And I remember
Right.
going into that summer, my expectation was Iron Man 3 is going to be the best movie of the summer. It's going to be great. You got Shane Black reuniting with Robert Downey Jr. This is the first like post Avengers film, and I was so excited for that. And then you had Man of Steel with Zack Snyder directing it. It had all this buzz behind it. It looks like DC was going to be making a big play for their own universe of films. I was very excited about that. And then the Wolverine, I'm just like, I remember X-Men Origins. And then, I wasn't really the biggest fan of First Class. So, and then also, The Last Stand. So I was very my impression going into that summer is Iron Man 2 is going to be the best movie of the summer. Man of Steel was going to be a close second. And then the Wolverine will probably be a distant third. And what happened after that is my actual opinion after seeing those movies ended up being almost a complete inverse of that expectation.
Mm-hmm. I was definitely more excited about Wolverine than the others. I've always been more into different Marvel heroes than DC heroes, and I think that's mainly just because that's what I started with comics wise as a kid. I didn't get as much into DC until a lot later, where I became a big fan of Nightwing and Green Arrow, Black Canary. Those are my go-tos for when I'm reading DC usually. Um, I will say I do love Dick's one of his first lines in the Titans live action series, and I'm not going to say which one that is because I'm not sure how PG you want the podcast.
Oh no,
But,
go ahead. Go ahead.
oh yeah, when he's beating on the thugs and they're like, "Hey, what about Batman?" He just says, "Fuck Batman." Loved it. Just loved that scene. Uh, I've always liked the idea of Superman, and so I was actually looking forward more to Man of Steel than to Iron Man. And I think part of that is because I did watch. I mean, one of the first superhero TV shows I remember watching as a kid would have been the Lois and Clark New Adventures of Superman with Dean Cain and Terry Hatcher. Um, and then Smallville, of course, where you sort of see Clark still screwing up and not really being perfect, as you'd expect, Clark Kent to be. So I was looking forward to it and seeing what they would do. I mean, obviously you just look at Henry Cavill and yeah, I mean, his jawline and his hair screams Clark Kent Superman to you. So it was visually a great casting choice. Um, but after Iron Man 2, I mean, I love Robert Downey Jr. as Iron Man, as Tony Stark. I mean, it's like they ripped him right out of the pages. Even the old Demon in a Bottle storyline from the '80s, with the way they were going in part of the movies there. But just the way Iron Man 2 went, I wasn't as excited for Iron Man 3, and I don't know if it was burnout necessarily or just seeing how the character worked better as part of the Avengers than as a solo act. But yeah, Wolverine from the get-go was the one that I was looking forward to the most that year. And I mean, I loved it. Again, I said earlier, I think I'll probably watch it 20, 30 times, and there's not a lot of movies I'll do that with, but it's one that, when there's nothing else going on, I want something in the background. It's one of the few that goes on, so.
Yeah. And so let's kind of talk about it. What were kind of some of your thoughts? And, well, first off, there are two versions of this film. So there is the theatrical version, and then there is an unrated extended version, which has more violence, some extended action, and a few extra footage. Which version did you watch? Did you watch the extended one, or did you watch the theatrical one?
To rewatch and get ready for this, I rewatched whichever one is actually on Disney Plus right now. And I
I'm not sure, but
think
my gut is that's probably the theatrical version then.
that would be my guess as well. I think I've got the DVD of the extended cut somewhere buried in my son's room. But I don't know that I would actually want to actually go in there to look for it at this point. Uh, but yeah, I did watch the one that's on Disney several times. Again, I've actually got it on right now with just the subtitles on because why not?
Hmm. So yeah, so my big thing is when I go back and I rewatch this film is I think the first 2/3 of the movie, with some small exceptions here and there, basically perfect. I think the first two
Yes.
thirds of this movie are amazingly well done. And then the last third, I think in the third act is really when the movie kind of falls apart a little bit because I think that's when you see the hand of the studio come in and it feels like that's when they're saying, "Hey, this is a superhero movie. We need to have a big superhero fight scene. It's set in Japan, so we have to have a big robot as well." And all that kind of stuff, it feels, and it really kind of drains the movie of a lot of the energy I think it's been building up throughout the first 2/3 of it.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I mean, the first 2/3, he doesn't want to be there. He's, trying to live up to an old sort of expectation, right? Yukio had to basically forcibly drag him all the way there, or at least, lead him with a bottle of booze on a stick as if it were a carrot sort of thing. But that last third, it did feel almost rushed. Like they try to do too much to finish it off. And yeah, I can totally see what you're saying with the studio coming in and being too heavy-handed with it and trying to say, finish it off. This is supposed to be a superhero movie. Where I don't know that this storyline, if you go back to the actual original storyline in the comics, if you would even really classify it as a superhero story, really, when you dive into the various aspects of it, it doesn't feel like it would. I mean, the original storyline, even with the inaccuracies and whatnot, just due to when it was written, I could easily see that kind of storyline being written by or written directed by Akira Kurosawa back in the 50s or 60s. Even those same elements from the story there, I could see. I could see him taking a hand at it if he were around and making this kind of film, and I would not be surprised if the directors and the writers did watch some old Kurosawa films just to take those aspects of it because he is probably the most famous filmmaker to come out of Japan, really.
Hmm. Did you ever see the Yakuza, the 1974 movie?
I don't think I watched that one. I'm trying to remember what the last one I watched of his was because I went and
Oh,
grabbed
this
some of
wasn't
his old
Kurosawa.
films.
This wasn't Kurosawa who made this. This was actually Sidney Pollack made this movie.
Oh,
Um,
okay. No, I don't think I've seen that one.
it okay, so it's a very good movie. It's also some inaccuracies, but I feel like that original Claremont Miller miniseries was heavily inspired by the Yakuza because the Yakuza, it was this story about Robert Mitchum. He had been in Japan in the post-war period, and then he goes back because to help to rescue his friend's daughter who's been kidnapped by the Yakuza. Um, and I really think that the original miniseries, it's very similar to the Yakuza. It's also very kind of like this neo noir kind of thing. It's much more focused on the cultural stuff, the character stuff, and it's a very small scale story in the scope of superhero stories. Whereas in this one, again, the first 2/3, I think they do a pretty good job of matching that. And then in the last third, it just kind of like that's when you get all this kind of superhero-y type stuff. And I really felt like that did a disservice to this movie because I felt like it was the same problem that very similar problem to what happened in X-Men Origins, where they're like, well, this is a superhero movie and we need to have lots of superhero type characters in it.
Yeah, and with Origins, they definitely went well overboard. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that threw me the most rewatching it now, knowing more about the original storyline, is just the way they shifted certain roles and certain characters around. Like even just flat out changing who the Silver Samurai was. I mean, certain things, yeah, you're expecting them to be changed for a movie. I mean, Yukio, she's still an absolute badass in the movie. Like some of her fight scenes are some of the best in the movie. Never mind Hugh Jackman's. I mean, it's expected with Hugh Jackman. He's been playing Wolverine as long as he has. I mean, even at this point, he'd been playing Wolverine for more than a decade. But yeah, Yukio's scenes were great. Her personality is completely different than in the comics, and they twisted it even further in the Deadpool films when they included her in there.
Well, that's actually a different character.
Is it supposed to be a different character in those?
It's supposed to be a different character. Yeah, same name, but it's supposed to be a different character.
Oh, okay. See, I thought it was supposed to be the same, but I mean, I hadn't delved into the Deadpool films as much. Yeah, I don't know. The film, you're right. The first 2/3 of the film, seeing the chase, the escape after the assassination attempt at the funeral, the whole Logan and Mariko on the run and in hiding. There's a lot of build up where he's developing a lot as a character just by learning to be a little bit more, hey, you can't fix absolutely everything. Just take what you can piece by piece and do your best with it. Sort of kind of coming to terms almost with everything that's happened to him over the last however long he can remember. And then it's just that rush at the end where you do have the changes to Viper and all her weird powers and scaliness and whatnot, and then the way they made the old man into the Silver Samurai. I mean, I think that was what the thing was throwing me the most rewatching it, was just knowing that Kenoichi is supposed to be, well, he's supposed to be the Silver Samurai. He's supposed to be the main, at least in part, antagonist year after year after year after the events of what were adapted for the movie. So it's a little bit that threw me with it, but as rushed as it is, I still think overall the film does work. But I think that's been a hallmark of a lot of the X-Men films, is there's a lot of parts that are really, really good and they hit the nail on the head, and then there's other parts that you're just looking at and going, why? Right? Like, good example. How many times have they messed up the Phoenix Saga already?
No, yeah, and the Phoenix Saga, it kills me that they had two bites of that apple and they screwed it up both times. The second time they screwed it up even worse than the first time. I don't know how you fuck that story up so bad twice in a row. But yeah, I think you had mentioned Viper, and I think she is one of the biggest downsides of this film, because her character just it's all in service of that last act. It's all like, we need to have more mutant type characters in here. And Svetlana Kojankova, who plays her, she's not even that intriguing. I mean, she looks great, but other than that, she's not really that intriguing of a character. She just has kind of like this charisma vacuum in the middle of the film every time she appears on screen.
Oh, you mean like January Jones in First Class?
Yeah, exactly. Very similar. I mean, to her credit, she has slightly more personality than January Jones had, but still,
True.
It's not a whole lot. And also onto the whole they're trying to find excuses to put more X-Men type stuff in this, making Yukio a mutant who could see the future. That really has no bearing on the story whatsoever. It's just it's only there so that we can have another mutant character in the movie.
Well, that, and so they had a thing that they could tie in when they did Logan.
Yeah,
right?
yeah. Which
took
also
that throwaway line.
Right, and and that is true also in this movie too, because he does have his hand on his heart when and there's blood everywhere, and then he does die for that minute. So it is set in that movie too, but it also works in two ways, because then James Mangold would revisit that when he did Logan. Yeah, absolutely. But yeah, that's the only real, and that seems more like a happy accident more than anything else. Like, I feel like Mangold was obviously not thinking of that when he made this movie. That was something that I think he probably went back to, and he's like, oh, we can tie this back in. I think that's really what he was thinking at that time. But I think Yukio, though, I think most of the changes they made to Yukio, with the exception of the mutant stuff, I thought worked very well for her character in this movie. Having her have this existing relationship with Mariko added a whole different dimension to it, and it's now not like this weird kind of love triangle thing like it was in the story. So I thought that worked very well.
I would agree with that, and I also think what worked is they tied in something in a way, whether intentional or not, that already sort of fits and you sort of expect with Wolverine's character, where he adopts basically these various young women throughout his career and sort of takes them under his wing and teaches them and protects them and guides them and ends up, pretty much caring for them as if they're his own kids. And I think you're right. I think that change from the comics relationship with Yukio really does work with this movie and work for her character and actually makes her more interesting than anything, especially when you take into account things that happen later in the comics, like when Wolverine adopts that is Amico, I think is the name.
Amiko, yeah.
Yeah, when he adopts her and then has Yukio raise her, this version of Yukio from the movie almost makes more sense to be raising Amiko, because then it's almost more like, Amiko's not his adopted daughter, it's almost like his adopted granddaughter at that point, with the relationship that the three of them would have. And you're right, you're absolutely right. I think it does work a lot better in terms of the relationship also within the movie itself between him and Mariko and Yukio. It makes a lot more sense. Also, definitely makes a lot more sense where it's not Yukio the one poisoning him to set up the whole big final battle.
Yeah. And I like that he has someone who can be like who can be a partner in this. And because that's something he hasn't really had in any of these movies. Like, you have the relationships he has with other characters, the kind of trust. It's always a very kind of like strained partnership in all the other movies. Whereas this one, it feels like him and Yukio, and I think it helps that Jackman and Fukushima, they have a lot of really good chemistry together when they're on screen. So you can really buy that kind of like older brother, younger sister dynamic that they have going on there. And you can understand why she would be helping Logan and why also Logan would end up trusting her as much as he does. And also we have, oh, sorry, go
even
ahead.
further, why she comes to care for him as quickly as she does and as much as she does. I mean, you see that scene you mentioned where he's cutting into his own heart to pull out the bug that the Viper put in him. She just looks absolutely devastated and distraught, and you buy it. Like when you're seeing that scene, that you're really buying that emotion on her face, that she actually cares this much for him already, even though she really barely knows him. I mean, he probably spends more time with Mariko throughout the movie after the whole escape than he actually does with Yukio, but it's still there, that chemistry in those early scenes with the two of them are together is built up enough that you start to really buy that connection.
Yes, I agree completely. And you mentioned Mariko and Tao Okamoto too. I think she does a really great job as Mariko and Mariko as a character in the comics had this weird kind of evolution because when she starts up, she's very much the kind of damsel in distress figure.
Yep.
She's very kind of like the prim and proper, basically Japanese Disney princess, essentially, is what she is. And then later on, when Claremont gets in this whole girls with guns phase, she ends up becoming like a total badass, and it just comes out of nowhere. And this movie, I think it does Tao Okamoto, she does a really good job of capturing both those aspects of Mariko, where she is, she does have this, prim, upper class, kind of like demure seeming on the surface, but underneath she does have this kind of quiet strength that I really think comes out. And when you find out that, she can actually hold her own pretty well, it makes sense.
It does. I mean, that whether intentional or not, probably not. Just again, lack of the internet and investigative resources available to Claremont at the time he was writing the whole thing. But now, especially knowing more about history, I mean, I was reading an article probably a couple months ago or something. They were doing a big archaeological dig at the battle site of Sekigahara, and they found that several hundred of the corpses of the combatants, they weren't male at all; they were female. And that idea of prim and proper in public, but if somebody invades the home, watch out. And I think that's really what we get with her character towards the end of the movie there, where you see her stepping up that little bit. And like you said in the comics too, I don't think Claremont might have intentionally tried to mimic that, but I think he did hit it somehow by accident.
No, I really think Claremont was just going by Japanese movies that were popular in the 70s and 80s, because that's really what same thing with Frank Miller too, because you see some of the stuff in those comics with like all the focus on like honor and all that kind of stuff, and just like, I've been living in Japan for over 15 years now. Nobody talks about honor the amount that they talk about them in those old Claremont comics. It's just, and there is not a Japanese woman in the country who is walking around their house in full kimono dress. That's like that does not happen.
No, comfortable pajamas and sweatpants exist for a reason.
Exactly.
Let's
Yeah.
be honest.
Yeah.
It is
I mean,
it
that
is
kind of.
kind of. Oh no, so go ahead. Go ahead.
No, I was just saying, like that stuff. It's just that stuff does not happen at all. Like it's very much that kind of stereotypical. This is what we've learned from movies type of thing.
And it's overblown. I mean, I was rereading a book recently that I read as a kid because I randomly remembered it. I don't know if you ever read. It's called Planet X. It was a Star Trek: The Next Generation X-Men crossover.
Oh, I've heard of it, but I haven't read it.
Yeah, so just based on the overblown focus on honor through so many Wolverine stories throughout the years, imagine the scenes involving Worf and Wolverine together, side by side. Some of it's great. I mean, the book came out 3 or 4 years before the original X-Men movie came out, and they were already cracking jokes about how much Xavier and Picard looked alike. That it just made it funny when they announced that Patrick Stewart was playing Charles Xavier. I loved it as a kid. Just when they announced that, I thought it was hilarious.
Yeah, that was always the biggest the most popular fan casting back when Star Trek: The Next Generation was on the air. I remember.
Oh, absolutely.
But yeah, and well, speaking of Wolverine too, I think also another disservice of this film, and I understand why they did it because they wanted to have this kind of fish out of water feel, and they wanted to have Wolverine be like the viewpoint character, so that when people explain stuff about Japanese culture, there's a story reason for it to be explained. But
It's funny you
on
say
the
that
other
right
hand,
now because I've got it on in the background. It's that scene where he and Mariko are eating and she's explaining chopsticks to him.
yeah, yeah, and which I again I understand for audience purposes and for story purposes why they did that, but on the other hand, I really one of the cool things about the original story is that you find out there's this whole chapter of Logan's life where he lived in Japan. He knows
Yep.
this culture. He was here for several years, and I think it would have been better if maybe not saying this is his first time in Japan, but you could still have that kind of like viewpoint character aspect if you say that after the war he was still in Japan, maybe he spent some time a few years there after during the occupation or whatever. And so and then you can deal with the fact that this is some of those memories that he's lost, and then maybe having different cultural things have some flashbacks to parts of his life that he's forgotten about or something like that. Something I think would have made it a lot more interesting.
I would agree with that because it was a big part of his life, and for so many years in the comics, one of the few eras of his life that he actually remembered, right? When the focus of the character for so many decades was that he didn't remember his past, but one of the things that he did remember was his time in Japan and his time in Madripoor, that they could have easily had a few scenes, I wouldn't say many, but a few scenes at least, where either Yukio or Mariko or somebody else is trying to explain the culture to him, and then he turns around and does something so on brand for the culture and so ingrained that it would just blow everybody else out of the water around him because they'd be like, well, where did this come from? How did you know this? Right? We just thought you were some random hairy Canadian guy that grandfather knew way back when. I think it would have been great for a few scenes. I mean, even the scene again where they're eating here, if he had, even before she said anything, had itadakimasu, right? Like if he'd even just something like that, just to throw her off in the scene, I think it would have added just a little something.
Yeah, I agree. I feel like that's a missed opportunity here because then his whole time with Japan, his whole history with Japan is just limited to just this one movie. And that was such a big part of his character in the comics that I feel like just reducing it to just this few basically like what is he there for, like about a week, maybe 2 weeks, and that's it. It does kind of do a disservice to that something that is such a big part of that character's history. And also, some of the casting, you're like, we have Hiroyuki Sanada as Shingen, and I feel like Sanada got robbed in this movie because Shingen is supposed to be the big villain of this storyline, and I was so excited when I found out that he was going to be playing Shingen, and he does it so well in those initial scenes, and then we find out he's just basically, a secondary villain, more or less, and then he ends up being dispatched fairly quickly. It was a big disappointment. I feel like this movie missed out on a big chance to really let Sanada kind of flex his muscle as that character.
Absolutely. I mean, he is an amazing actor. I think the first thing I remember seeing him in was, and I hate the main actor in the movie, but I love the movie in and of itself, despite the inaccuracies. But The Last Samurai. Loved his character in that. Loved Ken Watanabe in that one as well. Just he's such a strong actor, and I'm so glad that he got to do the lead role really in Shogun, and he did so good with it. And I love that he put his foot down and said, "No, you're casting Japanese actors for this series, period, or I walk." And he they did it, and it worked beautifully, absolutely beautifully. And it, other than the few scenes in the bar early in the Wolverine, now that I think about it, pretty much other than Hugh Jackman, most of the actors in the Wolverine are Japanese as well, which is great.
Yeah, there's one big exception, and it's kind of a glaring one, and that's William Lee as who's playing. They don't even say his first name. It's just Harada. They don't say Kenichio on that. Who is supposed again is a character that got robbed in this movie because they decided to
Absolutely.
give the Silver Samurai part to the elder Yoshida, and who it does is played really well by Haruhiko Yamanouchi, but still like. William Lee is Korean American actor, born and raised in America, and it's funny as soon as because I was watching this last night with my wife who's Japanese, as soon as Lee starts speaking Japanese, first like he says like maybe 3 words, and the first thing my wife says like that guy's not Japanese. I'm like, no, he's not.
I I think I lucked out learning Japanese the way I did. My teacher, I had a teacher in high school. She was actually born in the camps during World War II, if I recall correctly. And Okano Sensei, amazing woman. She was like 4'9", maybe 5 foot, biceps like Ben Grimm because she also did taiko, and lovely woman. And being able to learn Japanese from her rather than from books rather than from TV or sitting there and watching, dubbed and subbed anime both. Uh, Definitely give me a better appreciation, I think, for the language and the nuances of it and the difficulty of it. I wish I had more chance to practice it uh, where I am, but unfortunately I don't. So a lot of what I did know is lost. Do not ask me to read hiragana or katakana anymore. But I distinctly remember I had a trainee in one of my classes at work a few years ago who was originally from Japan, and you do that thing with new trainees. You get them all to stand up and introduce themselves, and he starts talking about being from Japan. And so I, you know, said thank you in a few words and asked him a few more questions in Japanese, and he just looked dumbstruck because he's in the middle of Canada. Like where I am, if you look at a map of Canada and you try to draw a belly button, that's pretty much where I am. And he was just floored that somebody here. He looks at the class, and they're like, "Well, what did he say?" He's like, "His accent's really good."
Yeah,
It
it's one of those
depends,
things
I guess,
where
who you learn it from.
it does. It does.
Really.
In fact, I remember a funny story when I first started because I started learning Japanese. I studied a little bit at university, but I really started seriously studying it once I moved out here. And when I started speaking more Japanese with my coworkers, it was funny. They asked me one time, and it was like at a drinking party, and it was sitting with a bunch of the men in the office, and I was saying something in Japanese, and they were all kind of like smiling, and I'm like, what is it? And they're like, you speak Japanese like a woman, right? Because so I had all my teachers were women.
I I was a few years back. I was at the dojo and I was training, and I had just switched dojos, started training more seriously again. I've been doing off and on since I was like 12. Started with Shotokan and then moved into Meibukan Goju-ryu, which is like a very traditional Okinawan style. And Sensei's calling things out, and we're going through the various techniques, and I couldn't help it. I just started laughing in the middle of class. He's like, "Well, what's going on?" He says, I have to translate several times in my brain what you're trying to say because it sounds like you have a speech impediment." And I had to like explain to him how to actually pronounce certain things. And he's like, "Well, what do you want? I learned it secondhand from an old white guy."
Yeah, yeah. Oh yeah. And so William Lee as Harada, right, was really kind of a disappointment because, and it's nothing against this actor. He's a pretty decent actor in his own right, and other stuff he's been in. It's just like I think he was set up for failure in a role that was underwritten to begin with when it should have been a much bigger part, and then you cast this guy who is probably has never spoken a word of Japanese before he did his research for this movie and was probably just being trained on set, and it was, you know, and then and you make the character speak mostly Japanese throughout his throughout the entire movie, which is again, why are you setting this guy up to fail when there are plenty of Japanese actors who can speak a bit of English, enough English at least for this, who could have done this role. I mean, you had Tadanobu Asano in the Thor movies. I mean, maybe he was busy filming for the Dark World at this point or whatever, I'm not sure, but you know, that's someone you could have had instead who I think would have been able to do this part and do it a little bit more justice, as well as the fact that, you know, it is an underwritten part, because I don't really understand what
his role in the film
is. Yes, yeah, exactly. Like, it's just because it's, on the one hand, he's trying to protect Mariko. So at first you think that, okay, well, this is the Black Hand, right? The Black Clan, they're stand-in for the Hand because Marvel has the rights to the Hand, so they can't use it. And he's supposed to be like leading them, and he's supposed to be out there protecting Mariko, but then it's like all these shit. It doesn't make sense why he's constantly going back and forth between these two, because the character is so underwritten that his role in the movie just feels completely superfluous.
Absolutely. I mean, you look at the history with Kenichi Harada throughout the whole thing, and he's there and supportive of Mariko grudgingly, right, in the comics. Like, there's always that hint that, like, he doesn't really think she should be in the role that she's in. I mean, even before she's eventually given control of my brain is blanking.
The Clan Yoshida.
Thank you. Yes, I don't know how I forgot Yoshida, but yes, before she's even given control of Yoshida, he doesn't. You always get the feeling he doesn't think she even really should be there. And even once she does take control, he is there. He is protective, more so of the clan itself than of her. He'll support her because she's the head of the clan, even if he doesn't agree with her. But he's always thinking through and has his own plans and his own, what if I were in control? What if I were running Clan Yoshida? How would we deal with the Yakuza? How would we deal with everything else? How would we deal with the Hand even? Because in the comics, he doesn't necessarily even want to be working with the Hand, is the feeling that you get, because they're not really like everyone else, because they're obviously they're demons. We know this, but he always seems to have his own plans, and that deviousness and that planning, you don't get the feeling from him of any of that in the movie. And you're right, it takes so much out of the character that it's almost like, why is he even there?
Since you're listening to this show, I already know you love watching superhero movies and TV shows, and you just might enjoy superhero comics. But how about superhero novels? I'm giving away 2 free superhero novels and 1 free superhero short story. Visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP to get access to Vanguard, Heroes Forged, the first novel in my own Avengers and X-Men inspired superhero novel series, and Ronin Born, my cyberpunk superhero novel set in a futuristic Japan. I'm also throwing in Fire and Lightning, a free prequel story to my new Power Rangers inspired superhero series Omega Knights. So visit percivalconstantine.com/SCP, those are just the letters SCP, to get started, or click on the link in the show notes. And now, on with the show.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. Like, that, taking away all those aspects of Harada's character was really kind of disservice, especially because in the comics too, he's not like a former lover of Mariko. They're half siblings, right? Shingen is his illegitimate father. So that aspect too, that sibling rivalry aspect, where again, this is one of the problems where you're going to have this idea of having the elder Yoshida as the main villain, is you're taking away all this stuff from not only from Shingen, but also from Harada, whereas he was the illegitimate son who felt like he was better positioned to this lifestyle than Mariko was. All of that is kind of taken away as a result of that. And then you just have him kind of shoehorned into this role, which doesn't really work. And I think it would have been more interesting if maybe you had I'm not sure. Maybe if you split the Shingen role between Shingen and Harada instead of splitting it 3 ways between Shingen, Yashida, and Harada.
Or even if you have Harada through the entire thing planning to take over, and it's him that takes over with the battle suit and everything at the end, killing the old man. And this was his plan all along. I think that would have been more fitting to the history of the character himself and that planning maniacal deviousness that he's got than just, here we go, we got a giant, battle mech suit. The other thing too, when you're talking about how underwritten the character is, they're looking for all these ways to shoehorn more mutants into the thing, with Yukio's foreshadowing and precognition and making Viper a mutant. I mean, Viper wasn't immune to poisons because she was a mutant. She was immune to poisons because she purposely dosed herself over and over and over again for years in service of Hydra, right? They're giving them mutant powers just for the sake of giving them mutant powers to shoehorn more in. Meanwhile, Harada is a mutant, and his
That's a
mutant
good
ability.
point.
His mutant ability is focusing a blade to basically make it like a micron thick, so it'll cut through absolutely anything other than adamantium, which made him always one of the great foils to Wolverine because his fighting skill not only matches, but he's also got something that can actually stop Wolverine's claws. That other than, Magneto ripping the adamantium out, or those few periods where you had Cyber or you had Sabretooth had his adamantium, you didn't really have any villains that were like that for Wolverine. You didn't have that foil, whereas Harada was sort of the way around that for years. So not only did they completely do his character a disservice by just taking all the wind out of him completely, but also just taking his powers away, it's almost as big a disservice as what they did with, well, Shadowcat and Rogue and Colossus in the other X-Men films up until, Deadpool, when Colossus actually felt like Colossus finally, right?
No, yeah, that's I had completely forgotten about, talking about all the mutants they're shoehorning in. It is so ironic that the one mutant character they have from this storyline, from this era, there's no mention of him being a mutant. It's so ironic. I don't know what they were thinking when they did that. But also too, the whole relationship with the Yakuza. And there was, because in the comics, the whole thing about the clan Yoshida is that they are involved in, there is a legitimate aspect and there's an illegitimate aspect to the family business. And that's the thing that Mariko is trying to steer away from. She's trying to steer it back into the more legitimate thing. And whereas Shingen and Harada, they don't care. They're fine doing the illegitimate stuff. And that is gone in here because none of that stuff is part here at all. And I think that's a mistake because this would have been a reason for the Yakuza to have more of an involvement here. And I did think one of the lines I wrote down, which I thought was funny, was when they come to Japan and Yukio says that the Yakuza have grown strong as the government has grown weak. It's actually the opposite of what's actually happened in the past in this time frame too. Like the Yakuza is actually in one of its weakest positions of all time right now. And the government's actually been cracking down on the Yakuza since like the early 2000s. So it's actually the complete opposite of what they claim. But I think it would have made more sense if you did have this idea of there is this illegitimate aspect of the family business that Mariko is not aware of, or she's aware of and she wants to clean it up. And if you did make it more of you did focus more on that idea of this family struggle for power that Wolverine is caught in the middle of, I think it would have made for such a much more interesting story. But and especially because the whole thing about Logan losing his powers, they kind of play fast and loose with that concept because he is bleeding out of multiple
Profusely.
gunshot wounds for a very long time. He should have died of blood loss before they even made it to that hotel.
Well, I think writers have always played it very fast and loose with his healing powers to begin with. There was over the last couple of years, it's one of the few things I read it in some reviews and articles, even though I haven't read all the newer titles because I'm trying to go through an order. There was one sort of throwaway line. Somebody asked him something about why his healing powers work better when they don't, because the amount of calories he's got, how much he's eaten, was sort of a throwaway line to it, where he's almost like like Barry Allen, where he's got to eat so much for the powers to actually work properly, otherwise he'll burn out. maybe Mariko stuffed him full of food while they were sitting in that cabin. I mean, I don't know. I mean, that's the only thing I can think of. But you're right. They did what they needed to do to keep him going for the story. But I mean, even in the original comic, he was a lot weaker after Yukio poisoned him before that big end fight than they even show him in the movie. I mean, he probably takes a good several hundred bullets over the course of the whole thing, at least.
Well, I mean, yeah, and like that whole the Shinkansen fight scene, like the bullet train fight scene, I thought was well done, like amazingly well done. But it was kind of annoying when I'm watching it and I'm seeing like he is bleeding from multiple gunshot wounds. And it's at this point, it really makes me wonder what purpose is the power loss even serving here? Because it doesn't feel like it feels like it's coming and going. And they're only using it when they want to remind us that he's lost his powers. Otherwise, he seems to fight just fine with multiple gunshot wounds. It There's not much about it when when they make it to Nagasaki and they're in her family's home, right? It's just kind of like that whole plot line just kind of like disappears for that whole stretch of time. And it's not until the only time it really becomes a factor is when he is trying to get that thing out of his body while Yukio is fighting Shingen. That's the only time it really seems to serve any purpose for the story.
Yeah, I would have to agree. I mean, just watching through it now, even again, I'm at the part where Yukio is sort of following him, and he says, "Wait in the car," and he's limping. That's really, one of the few indicators you've got that something's still not right with him after being poisoned. But they really do. Yeah, fast and loose is, as you said, is the best way to describe the way they do it, because there's. Okay, I will
also
say,
too, like.
I do love
I'm
the scene
trying
here coming up with the pool.
Oh yeah, the pool. I do want to talk about that. I love that scene as well. But I do want to talk about Brian T as well, who also does a really good job in this. But that whole the whole parasite thing, like I'm struggling to think, and I'm just rereading the plot summary here on Wikipedia. It doesn't actually serve a story purpose because they don't need to use that. He doesn't take the healing factor away from Logan until the end in that big fight scene, right, when he drills into the claws. So
The only thing I can think of is the idea behind using it was, I don't want to use the word docile, but maybe slightly more controllable might have been their idea behind it, so that they know full well how dangerous he is when he's at full power. So even if it's not going to stop him and allow them to kill him, maybe it'll slow him down. Maybe that's what they were going for with it, but even then, it seems like a bit of a stretch.
Yeah, especially because when they have access to him when he's sleeping at the house, right? She poisons him. That seems like the perfect time. You poison him, maybe you stick the thing in him then, and then you take him, take him away in the night.
Why wait?
Exactly. Why wait? Like there doesn't seem to be any reason why. It doesn't feel like, and then at the end when they leave the message for him to come and get it, and then it seems like, Shingen's able to handle him pretty well, even when he does have his healing powers back. So yeah, that whole storyline about him losing his powers just doesn't feel like it really matters much.
Or even if you're going to nick his powers, I mean, do it on the plane where he can't go anywhere.
Right, exactly. Well, yeah, that's another thing too. I mean, you could have done it there. You could have done it. He's drinking that whiskey. You could easily have slipped something in there, something that's maybe odorless or toxin or something. Any of those would have made much more sense. But you did mention the pool scene, and I did like this. The Brian T playing the Nobudo.
Yep.
And I feel like he had done some research because this guy comes off as every single corrupt politician in the Liberal Democratic Party in Japan. Like he fits that mold to a perfect, right down to the political flyers. I'm just like, I could easily see this guy's flyers around my neighborhood.
Right, absolutely perfect in public, and then you look in the scene. He's got all the girls with him and all the cocaine and everything in the penthouse suite there, and you're right. The corruption and everything. He plays the role well, like the way he plays, like he's trying to be strong. He's trying to not be afraid in the face of the boogeyman, right? That story's been told about now for years, and I just love watching him take the nosedive off of the penthouse thing in the pool. And she says, "How did you know there's a pool down there?" I didn't. It's just a great. Just the end of that scene. I can't help but chuckle every time that scene comes up.
Well, also just like the dichotomy between him and Logan, like when Logan walks in and he's just like, he's like, you've got 10 words to explain to me why you, the Minister of Justice, tried to have your fiance killed. And then he just goes right into politician, threatening mode, and Logan just punches him in the face. And then he asks Yukio,
Turns
how many
to
words was
Yukio.
that?
Yep.
And she says 9. He's like, wait, you've got 1 word left now.
And you can see his face, like he's just thinking, and he blurts that 1 word out. And he's like,
Mhm.
okay, you've got my attention.
And he's like, and if I don't like what you say, then you're going through that fucking window. And then at the end, he says, like, but you said I'd be okay. He's like, yeah, but I didn't like what you said.
Which again just fits Logan to a T. I mean, you have to listen to the words themselves and the intent behind them. You can't just assume that he's going to think and act like absolutely everyone else, because he's not. I mean,
Yeah.
this is a character that is, about 200 years old, whether he knows it or not at the time. He has seen some shit, to put it mildly. He's seen the absolute best that humanity has on offer and the absolute worst that humanity has on offer, and everything in between. And he doesn't just take anything at face value from pretty much anybody, because he doesn't know if it's real, if it's not real, if it's somebody planning to stick him in a tank again and experiment on him, or if it's somebody that's just gonna try and chop his head off. Because again, how many times has that happened throughout his history? How many times have people tried to kill him, even deserved or not? I mean, this is a guy that has seen more collective warfare and fight scenes than Connor McLeod.
And also, I like the aspect they put in with Mariko. It's a small little thing, but when they're in bed together and he wakes up, he has the nightmare and his claws come out, and she wakes up and she sees his claws, and she's not scared, right? She just like gently touches them.
Yes.
Like, I thought that was such a great and one of the biggest downsides of them jumping forward in time to then doing the Logan movie and also getting wrapped up in the whole Days of Future Past stuff and all that is that we didn't get to see more of this relationship develop. Because I wish we could have gotten another movie where we could see more of Logan and Mariko together, because they work really well. Yeah. Her death. Absolutely. Yes. That would be such a tragic story to see play out on the screen. And I think it would have been, I would have much rather have seen that as opposed to, and as much as I like Days of Future Past, I would have much rather see a sequel to this movie, which picking up on this storyline.
I absolutely agree. I mean, don't get me wrong. In terms of all the X-Men movies as a whole, like the ensemble X-Men movies, Days of Future Past is probably one of the strongest, if not the strongest of all of them. But you're right. That extra one movie with him and Mariko and their relationship, and that just the way she dies in the comics, that death defined so much of his character for so long, and that is a massive piece of concrete-filled baggage that he carries with him throughout so many other storylines in the comics for years and years and years, and stops him from actually getting close to a lot of other people. And it's still referenced now. I mean, I don't know if you've played any of Marvel Rivals at all, but Penny Parker says to him in the one, when you're on the one map, one of the voice lines that triggers, Penny asks him something about his first time in Japan or something like that, and he says, "So I met a nice girl here once." And it's just that small little reference, but it's so much of how he interacted with so many other characters throughout the rest of his history over the last 20 years, since 30 years even, since Mariko was killed off in the comics.
Yeah,
influenced his relationships. I mean, even with the reporter Melita, when the X-Men are in San Francisco in and around like 2009, 2010.
Right, the Jason Aaron run, yeah.
Yeah, even that relationship is still very, very clouded by his loss of Mariko and how that happened and how that went down. And even he says at the beginning of the relationship something along the lines of, "People that get close to me die."
Yeah, right? I mean, it's his Gwen Stacy. That's his Gwen Stacy moment.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would argue that it's a little bit different, because
it is different, because Gwen Stacy, there's some question as to whether or not Peter actually killed her when he did the web line, because there's also
physics,
but this too is obviously, there's no question that he's the one who delivered that killing blow to her, because there was no other choice.
Right. I would argue, though, with Peter and Gwen, it's a little bit different. Arguments about whether or not he killed her or not aside, I'm on the side that he didn't, because I don't think the writers considered that at the time. I think that's us as fans digging more into it now after years of retrospection. I think though, and somebody I was having a conversation with the other day online actually made a very good point that Gwen's death, Uncle Ben's death was really what pushed Peter to being a hero in the first place. But Gwen's death was sort of a bit of a different defining moment, I think, for Peter, in that when she died, it made him realize that sometimes you do everything you can, even doing things the right way, and sometimes you still lose. It's like that old Patrick Stewart line as Jean-Luc Picard about how you can still make the right decisions and lose, and that's just life. And I think Mariko's loss for Wolverine is a bit different because it's just another tragedy piled onto more tragedy piled onto more tragedy. Whereas with Peter, it was more of a realization moment, a big shift for him, because that was only the second person he'd ever really lost, right? I mean, sure, he lost his parents, you could argue, but that's so far before any of the comics were written, happening in his childhood, that it really doesn't have a lot of effect on his character growth throughout
Right.
the last 50 years, right?
No, that's a good point. And yeah, that is just more tragedy lumped on him. And that's something that we don't get a lot of in these movies, I feel, is like the tragic side of Wolverine's story. We have some of it with the Weapon X project, but but they screwed up the Silver Fox thing. So that aspect of it was completely screwed up.
I'd say Silver Fox was screwed up from the beginning. The amount of times they've tried to cover it, even in the comics, been.
But and then the Mariko story, we get her here, and they have such great chemistry. The relationship is so well developed, and she even talks about how you're going to come back and visit me soon. He says, "Yeah, but there's some stuff I have to take care of first." And then zero mention of her ever again in any of these movies. Like the only reference we get is he still has the Yashida sword when in Logan, but that's the only reference we ever get. Otherwise, they never mention her again. There's never a mention of what happened to her between this movie and Days of Future Past. I mean, he's at the airport, so maybe we can assume that he is going back to Japan to visit her when the Sentinels come up and everything, because otherwise why else would he be at the airport? But we get no mention of her in Days of Future Past, no mention of her in Logan, no mention of her in, I mean, I know Deadpool and Wolverine is a different version of Wolverine, but still, she's never mentioned again.
Yeah, I mean, you're right. Mariko was really his defining love, right? I mean, other than his oddly weird obsession with Jean for so long, right? She was Mariko was the one that he loved, that he actually wanted to be with, that he was intending to marry, and of course, he ends up marrying Viper instead by accident. But that's another story for another time. You'd think that one really defining relationship would affect more things. You would talk about them more, especially with how long he's been around and how much he's experienced. You'd think that a relationship that defined the character for so long in the comics would at least be given a little bit more than just a throwaway Easter egg in the background of future movies, right? But even in the subsequent movies, there's still, mention and thoughts of Jean. And don't get me wrong, I loved Famke Janssen as Jean. I thought she was great, but Mariko's the one that was really it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think too, when they bring him back in Days of Future Past, and he sees Jean at the end, and he has this like longing thing for her, I feel like, again, that's doing a disservice to, because one of the big things in this movie is him, which we'll talk about the Jean stuff too. That's what I want to get to next. But the is like him finally moving on from Jean is what happens in this movie. And again, one of the problems I've had with these movies is, there are different problems I've had. One of them is this whole focus on Jean and Logan, because the whole thing about Jean and Logan is that it's always just been kind of like
one-sided.
She's fascinated by him. Yeah, it's very one-sided. She's fascinated by him, but it's it's more of just like kind of like it's an appeal to like her wild side type of thing, but it's not like. And then over time they develop what is more of a friendship. Like I don't like the idea of them getting together in some way, because for me his ultimate relationship is Mariko.
For sure. I mean, in the comics even, I think the only time that he and Jean actually got together was in the Age of Apocalypse storyline. when him and Jean end up married after the original Age of Apocalypse run, and that's something that's only really even touched on. I mean, it's sort of hinted at, but it's only like really given more depth in them actually being married in the later, when they've gone back to Age of Apocalypse in the what was probably, judging by when I was reading through my run, was probably about 2005, 2006
Right.
or whatever ish. The Jean relationship just never made sense. But I mean, there's a lot of things about Jean that don't make a lot of sense. I mean, what was it, one of the very first issues from '63? Even Xavier's talking about being in love with Jean. There's a few thought
Oh
bubbles.
God, yeah. Oof. Oh, that was that was definitely some creepy stuff in there. Better
You've
left
talked about
better
age
left
gaps
forgotten.
before.
Yeah, Jesus. um, well, and let's talk about the Gene thing, because I feel like one of the things that kind of confused me about this movie is what kind of happened, because by the end of The Last Stand, it feels like Logan has stepped into his role as being like one of the leaders of the X-Men. And then we get to the beginning of this movie and he's retreated out to the Canadian wilderness. He's living in a cave. And other than Jean and, some surveillance photos in that dossier that Yukio has, there's no mention of the X-Men at all.
Nope, none.
So it feels like this whole movie, and it's weird because there's the scene like when obviously they know about mutants because Shingen talks about at the funeral how, his father was always fascinated with your kind. So there's that aspect of it. So we know the public is aware of mutants and all that, but it feels like this is the fact that there is no connection to the X-Men in any sort of real way. There's no sort of mention of what's happening with the X-Men at all. Like, it'd be one thing if
Until
like
the
he
post
had
credits.
yeah, well, yeah, and yeah, or in the edited scene, which we could talk about too. But it does feel like a really big hole in this movie. Like, it feels like this movie is almost divorced from the rest of the X-Men film continuity. Like, even if it was, some unopened letters from the Xavier Institute or something, or like,
It's one of the things that I've noticed a lot of the film studios have been doing, most notably Sony, with the movies, divorcing the character that's the main character in the film from the other characters that are tied to that have so much influence on defining the character themselves. I mean, doing a Venom series of movies and Carnage without Spider-Man, Morbius, Craven, again, without Spider-Man. Well, it's the same. Wolverine without the X-Men. Yes, Wolverine's for the longest time has had his own solo title and he's known as the lone wolf amongst the X-Men. But Wolverine at his best is a member of the X-Men. I mean, even in the earliest days when they didn't even know his name was Logan, right? He was at his best when he was actually working with the team and the relationships that he builds. And there was one of the issues I just finished recently after something happens. It might have been something dealing with Romulus or something like that. I can't quite recall, but he retreats off into the wilderness on his own, ends up living with a wolf pack again, and sort of just tries to completely distance himself from all of society and everything. And there's these amazing, amazing panels across several pages, and it's split up with a few frames in between each, but it's just a headshot of all of these different characters saying just a couple of words about
oh yeah, yeah,
who Wolverine is and what he means to them as a person or what they think of when they think of him. Namor's is hilarious. He's a terrible swimmer. Well, yeah, when you've got several hundred pounds of adamantium bonded to your body, you're gonna sink like a stone. But those relationships that he makes and the way he unites other people despite not liking people as a whole on his own and preferring to be on his own does define him a lot as a character. So when you take him away from the X-Men or when you take him away from the Avengers or even, that brief period where he was a variant member of the Fantastic Four with Mr. Fix-It and Ghost Rider, right? That's when he's been at his best. And when you take him away from the team, yes, you get some interesting storylines, but even in the original storyline, if I recall correctly, wasn't Kitty with him the entire time he was in Japan?
no, that was in the Kitty Pryde and Wolverine miniseries.
Oh, right, when Ogon comes back.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't. I get your point. I don't fully agree. I do think I think I actually feel like he works better a lot of times when he's in his solo adventures when he's separated from the X-Men type stuff. Like one of my favorite Wolverine stories in the comics was the Greg Rucka Derek Robertson run, that first, I think it was called The Brotherhood, where he's completely divorced. There's like nothing to do with any of the X-Men stuff, and he works very well in that, and in kind of like a modern Western type of setting. And I think but I feel like but if you're going to acknowledge all these X-Men things, but you're going to leave out this other stuff, is really the things that I felt was jarring about this movie, because you're going to keep referencing this fact that he's not with the X-Men, and that he's still haunted by the memory of Jean, and I felt like it wasn't that necessary. I felt like you could have done this story without the whole idea of him running away to the wilderness to try and run away from his responsibilities.
Well, yeah, I mean, how many times in the comics? I see where you're getting at. There are a lot of good solo Wolverine stories. I just was thinking you get the most growth out of him when he's around the others and building those relationships. But in the aspects of this story, you're right. I mean, the hallucinations of Jean there weren't really needed. It could have even just been as simple as him, being in the wilderness just to get away from the killing, to try and find some peace finally for once. That's then broken by the idiot hunters poisoning their arrows, going after the grizzly, right? Dragging him back into a semblance of society where he actually can be found by someone else. I mean, it almost didn't even make sense in the story for Yukio to find him right at that instance, right? If he's been out there and like really out there, which is definitely fitting to the character when he wants to be on his own, he'd be completely off the grid. I mean, you're looking at panels in the comics, and it's those few times when he's away, it usually opens up with a little text box saying, several hundred miles from the nearest town. It would take him actually popping up on the grid somewhere, like a bar fight where he, cuts the fingers off of some idiot hunters, for Yukio to even find him in the first place.
Yeah, instead she's there waiting, and like it'd be one thing if we saw like her, and you don't even have to show the X-Men, just like show her like driving away from the X-Mansion or something like that would have helped to establish
or
something about
a scene of her doing surveillance on the other X-Men to see
right.
if they're calling him, or they're looking for him, or if there's any sign of him having been around, or even her doing surveillance on some of the students and saying, "Hey, where did Professor Logan go?"
Mm-hmm.
Right? Might have been more to tell her, "Hey, he's not anywhere near here. He hasn't been for a while. I should look elsewhere." Right?
Or maybe have like a montage of him leaving the X-Mansion and her surveilling him and following him along the path, and then maybe he goes maybe he's just going up to the wilderness for like a long weekend or something, because he does that from time to time in the X-Men, where he just fucks off for a period of time.
Yeah, usually pisses Scott off to no end.
So yeah, I thought that the Jean stuff, it was really jarring in that way, especially because there's all this focus of this guilt he feels for Jean. But then he's going to sleep with Mariko before he's even resolved those feelings. It also felt jarring too.
Well, yes and no, almost, because even when he's had other things going on, I mean, the only other person in the comics that I think gets around more than Wolverine is Dick Grayson. So, I mean, Wolverine, he does sleep around a lot, whether or not he's thinking about somebody else or not.
But that hasn't been established in the movies, though.
That's okay. Yeah, that's true. When
so in the comics, I can understand, but from the perspective of the movie, and I'm a big proponent of, if you want to replicate something in the movies, you have to lay that groundwork for it. So like that was one of the things that annoyed me about Batman v Superman, is you have these things that happen because these are things we expect of the characters in the comics. Like we expect Lex Luthor hates Superman, but that's never explained in the movie, and it's just like
it's never explained why.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And so I think for him to, if you're going to have him be a womanizing character like he is in the comics, he is this kind of guy who sleeps around a lot, then I think we needed more. That needed to be set up in some way, but otherwise it comes off as just he's hung up on Jean, and then he just, before he's resolved those feelings, he just jumps into bed with this other woman. It felt very incongruous to the story they were trying to tell.
Yeah, because the only other reference that you sort of get to him doing things like that is the way he wakes up in his younger body in Days of Future Past,
which came after this movie.
Well, exactly. Yeah. No, that's I do kind of wonder when these guys are going and making these sequels to these films, if they're actually sitting around and discussing the previous films the way we do, to try and
I feel like they are not, because I mean, back when I talked about First Class, I talked about all the incongruities between the continuity. It feels like different people had different ideas about whether this movie was supposed to be a reboot, whether it was supposed to be a prequel. It's like nobody knew what the hell was going on with it, and it feels like nobody has ever just sat down and done a marathon of these movies before writing the next one.
I I think that's one of the things that gives me at least a little bit of hope with turning the MCU around, with Kevin Feige sort of being given free rein to do what he wants. It seems like he's got the formula down, and there's enough faith in him that the bigwigs are going to not poke in as much. But I mean, how many times have the studio execs ruined things for the movies? I mean, the original Spider-Man film, the Tobey Maguire one. Okay, they had John Michael Straczynski come in and write a bunch of lines to spruce up the script towards the end after most of the filming had been done, but they wanted to add a little bit more. And it's easy enough to just have the actor, re-record a couple of lines when he's wearing a full face mask, right? And he wrote all these great lines, and his run on Ultimate Spider-Man was absolutely fantastic.
Amazing.
I mean, absolutely some of the best Spider-Man stories, other than I'm always going to be a big fan of the clone stuff in the '90s with Ben Reilly as Scarlet Spider. Freaking love that set, or when he takes over for Pete. But he wrote these lines, and they threw every single one of them away. And the one that stands out was something about where he's making fun of Goblin's suit. And they're like, well, what, you can't do that. You can't have that line in there. We spent $6 million on that suit. It's like, yeah, but that's the point. He would make fun of it because that is who he is. That is what he does. That's how he deals with the fear of being in these ridiculous situations, is he mouths off. And we see so many choices that get made, like the giant silver robot samurai, that feel shoehorned in, that just don't necessarily make sense for the characters or for the history of the characters, and they just sort of do whatever they want. And I think that's one of the things that's been so hit or miss with the X-Men films, especially because there's so many things. And it's funny. We were in the car the other day, my wife and I. She's a huge nerd too, and love her for it, and my son. And we're talking about just the various X-Men films in general, and things that they got so right with some of the characters in terms of even just the personality of the characters, and so many things that they got wrong. I mean, no one expected a rom-com actor from Australia to be able to play Wolverine, and now none of us can imagine anybody else playing him. Right? But other things like Nightcrawler, like Alan Cummings is great, but the way they portrayed Nightcrawler in X-Men 3 was just, where was his love of life, his adventure, that swashbuckling Errol Flynn? I mean, you didn't see that properly on screen until X-Men 97.
Right. Yeah. No, yeah, I agree. And yeah, and we're getting kind of so let's wrap this up because we're almost at the end here. And one thing last thing I want to talk about was the edited scene from the end of the movie, where Yukio presents Logan with the box, and it has the classic costume in it, or the classic mask at least.
Yes. Okay.
So now, what did you think? What did you think? Do you think that scene should have been in the movie? What's your take on the mask?
I think we should have gotten him in the mask long before we finally did in Deadpool versus Wolverine. I think the idea in the deleted scene of the mask being the brown and orange version, I do enjoy it. I do like that. I do like the idea of the costume coming from Yukio. I just wish we'd gotten to see him in it at least once. Like,
so
just,
here's my
just
thing.
Once.
This is probably one thing that sets me apart from most Wolverine fans is I fucking hate the mask. I think it's just
Really?
I hate the mask. I think like he looks so iconic with the hairstyle that I feel like the mask is completely unnecessary. And when we saw the mask in Deadpool and Wolverine, I thought it was a cool moment there. But when we lingered on it, it also really kind of reminded me that the white eyes thing for the mask that Batman fans on Reddit are always say that they need to have happen in the live action. I think it proves why it doesn't work, because it just feels like it doesn't allow the actor to emote in the proper way, and it just feels very kind of off-putting when they're trying to communicate in those moments. And just like I don't like the mask, and I thought and to the credit, like the design they did in the movie in this edited scene, it is a good design. It's just I just never have liked it.
One of the things that I didn't like about when they did it in Deadpool versus Wolverine is the ears, for lack of a better term, were just too big. For an actual human head, they were too big. I've really liked in the comics where they've started to go to the smaller ears, the really big, hyper exaggerated ones. Like if you remember the that first issue that Jim Lee did, and that massive splash 3-page cover where they're gigantic, like you could use them to shovel snow in the middle of a Canadian winter. I mean, Colossus just picks them up, turns them upside down, and you'd be fine. Uh, it's too big, and the ones on the mask in the box that Yukio gives him, I think, were a little more well proportioned to an actual human head. And I almost wish that that brief scene that we got in Deadpool versus Wolverine, where they do show the John Byrne brown and orange costume, that he'd had the mask on there. But I understand why they left it off to have that like big reveal at the end of the film. But I definitely see what you mean. I mean, there's so many scenes even in the comics where he's just not even wearing the mask, and it's just the suit. But it would have been nice to see him in at least a little bit of color other than just black leather.
Yeah. Well, I do think that if one exception to the mask is I thought John Cassaday, when he drew like the smaller flaps more like they were in the first appearance, I thought those worked better. If it's the much smaller flaps, I think it works better. But even still, like I'm just like, he's not a character who has a secret identity, so the mask thing just never really felt like it's something that really matters much, especially when he's got such a distinctive look anyway.
Well, and everybody knows who he is, even in the comics, because he's been around so long and in so many places. I mean, even on the news, in the comics, everybody knows who Wolverine is. He's the short one with the claws. You know, he walks into a bar, and the smart people, walk out.
Yeah. So one other thing I wanted to quickly talk about here is, so now we know that we're getting MCU. We're eventually going to have Wolverine and the X-Men and all them pop up in the MCU. What would you like to see happen with Wolverine in the MCU going forward?
Casting aside, because there's so many different opinions and so many different thoughts of who would work and who wouldn't work, I wouldn't mind seeing a smaller stature actor give a go at it, especially if they can bulk up and get that brawniness, that power lifter build to him, rather than, taller and lankier. It's funny. I saw a bunch of people saying Cavill's too big to play Cyclops a while back. I'm like, actually, Cavill's smaller than Cyclops if you actually look up the stats. He's lighter and shorter. I think I'd like to see more of Wolverine in the mentor and leader role. We got a little bit of it with his relationship with Anna Paquin's Rogue, which was a terrible version of Rogue. I'm sorry. No shame to Anna Paquin. They just wrote the character terribly for that one. But I would like them to do, and I know I'm probably very alone in this compared to so many fans out there, I would like them to do Shadowcat properly and really see that mentor role, see him really step into that mentor protector role with Shadowcat, because that was some of the earliest real growth that you had in him as a character, and not just being on his own, but actually taking care of someone else. Even if she annoyed the shit out of him early on, he still just immediately felt that protectiveness. And I think that mentorship, as much as the violence and the berserker rage and his relationship with Jean are defining moments for his characters, repeatedly, year after year after year, he's taking these other characters under his wing, and that sort of becomes his focus. And I think that is a big part of his character that could lead to some really, really interesting storylines, especially when you end up with interactions with everyone else in the MCU. If you're going to continue on with Wolverine in the MCU, and I don't see why they wouldn't, he's too much of a moneymaker for them, I think that would be a really interesting way to go, because you could end up having an almost Liam Neeson Taken moment come out of it if you wanted to do another solo Wolverine movie down the line. Ultimately, storyline-wise, I think one of the biggest things that Marvel could do that would actually, I think, be the best for the health of the series as an overall is drop Wolverine, drop Jean, like completely. There's so many other X-Men characters with so much storyline that there's almost this feeling that I have that they're going to fall into the same issue that DC has, where they've got dozens and dozens of amazing, amazing characters, but their focus is always on Batman, always on Superman, always on Wonder Woman, that not enough of their other characters get enough of the spotlight to show how amazing they are. And I think as long as you have Wolverine there, that's going to be a real danger. And as much as I love Wolverine and he's one of my favorite characters, because he's there, not enough other characters get a chance to really shine, I think is one of the problems, one of the pitfalls you can really run into.
No, I think that's a good point. And I think where I land is, first off, I love Hugh Jackman, but I don't want to see him playing this character until he's 90. Like, I mean, let's, you know, have him pop up in Secret Wars, okay, and then let the guy take a break, for Christ's sake. I mean, the dude's in his 50s. I mean, let him take a break so he doesn't have to constantly torture his body to get into this shape.
I remember an interview he did just after Logan came out, and somebody asked him, "So you've been playing Wolverine for 17 years. What is the first thing you did when filming wrapped and you knew you weren't going to be playing this role anymore?" He says, "Honestly, I went and ate the biggest bowl of pasta I could find because I haven't touched carbs in 17 years."
So yeah, I mean, just let the dude take a break, for crying out loud. So that's one thing. And honestly, as far as casting, I will say one casting note. I know I'm not breaking new ground here. Lots of people have said this, but I really think Daniel Radcliffe has a good look for the character. I mean, he's got the scruffiness. He's
Yes.
5'5", so he's got the height aspect of it. He's a
Yes.
good actor too. So
He
honestly, I
is.
think that would work.
He's done a lot of whatever he feels like doing for a long time. I don't know that he would want to necessarily do something this big anymore because
That's a good
made
point,
his
too.
money off the Potter films to the point that he can go and do what he wants, and that's why he's taken a lot of weird little roles. I mean, an uncle of mine even was in the one movie of his that was just weird, Horns. He was in that with him. And yeah, absolutely, yeah, lovely actor by all accounts. So he would definitely fit that bill behind the scenes, helping to sort of unite the cast kind of thing. Definitely has the height. Definitely has the commitment to roles where he could absolutely bulk up. One of the other oddball ones that I've heard tossed around that I think could potentially work as well was Taron Egerton.
Oh yeah. I've heard that one as well.
Again, same kind of stature, same kind of height, and same kind of commitment to roles. I mean, look what he did playing Elton John. I mean, he just threw himself into that. Again, I could also see him stepping up. There's also casting somebody unknown,
Yes,
right?
yeah.
That blows you away and fits the bill could be a way to go. My only thing is if they bring him in and they do end up doing Jean, they need to stay away from the Phoenix Saga because they're not going to get it right. I mean, even the original storyline in the comics was problematic for a few reasons. The only thing that's gotten it even close was the original X-Men animated series from the 90s, but only because they actually took the time to bring the Shi'ar into things, because that's really where you get into it. That's why Jean had to die, is because she blew up a friggin' planet and billions of lives, and it basically had a death sentence on her from the Shi'ar. If it wasn't for that, I mean, they still would have kept trying to do everything they could to save her, and it wouldn't have come to that point where she sacrifices herself. And I don't think that they're really at a point that they can do that in the movies. I mean, I'm sure part of the reason that they didn't include the Shi'ar in any of the other films, even the spacefaring ones like Guardians and whatnot, is probably because of rights, because the Shi'ar are too tied to the X-Men and probably were tied to Fox. But even with that, I mean, you've established the Kree, you've established the Skrulls, and the Nova Corps and everything else, but there's never been any mention to the Shi'ar, and the Shi'ar were the big bads in space, really. So where is the threat going to come from to kill her if they do the Phoenix Saga? Because they haven't established that.
I think I would want to see the Phoenix Saga done eventually in the MCU, because I think there is a way to do it right. But I think that they would know enough, and after the previous mistakes, to take their time to develop that story and build up. Because more than the Shi'ar, I think the real crux of that story is you have to build up the Scott and Jean relationship, which they never did in the movies. And
they were just together already.
Right, yeah, and there was no we never really saw them interact together other than like one deleted scene from the first movie. So there was never really much of a build up between them. And then the focus shifted.
Not until the recasting.
Right, and and they didn't even really build it up. It was just basically in that first part of the movie, and that was it.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think they could do that. But what I would really like to see, and this kind of goes to what you were saying about the focus shifting too much to Wolverine in these movies, is honestly do a Wolverine series on Disney Plus and have it focus on his solo adventures. Like have him in Madripoor, have him in Japan, have him do these stories where he is away from the X-Men. That way you can have a whole bunch of Wolverine type stuff there. And then when he comes in the X-Men, he doesn't have to be the main character.
Honestly, that might be a really good way for them going forward in period, like in general for Marvel. I mean, look at how well the Daredevil series worked,
Mm-hmm.
right? There's some storylines that just work better over a longer series that you just can't tell in a movie. Or if they're worried about the time and everything, do an animated series. It's not like adult animation is a new thing. There's been
Mm-hmm.
animated series specifically for adults for years. You could make it easily like PG-14 so that some kids can still watch it as long as their parents are okay with it, and cover a lot of those other events quicker and cheaper than worrying about the full sets with the
Mm-hmm.
same voice actor to familiarize the audience with them, get them used to the character, get them used to that voice and those mannerisms, and then seeing them live and on screen. It would almost even benefit as like a build up or practice for the actor to be on live screen to really shine in the movies. And that would let us get a lot of the side characters, let us get a lot of the origins out of the way so they're not constantly retelling origins every couple of movies for these new characters, so that we're already sort of familiar with them when they are in those big ensemble casts.
I think whether or not they went to do something like that, I think would depend on how well it works out with DC, because they're apparently doing that with Creature Commandos, where the voice actors are supposed to be playing those characters in live action. So I guess we'll see how it works there. If it works there, then maybe you could see Marvel adopting a similar formula. But anyway, we're way over time now. So Travis, thanks so much
Sorry.
for coming on. That's okay. But why don't you tell people where they can find you?
Well, main spot right now would be over on Blue Sky. Been on there for a couple months now, and it's just Travis James Inks, all one word. Dot bsky dot social. I'm usually posting on there every couple of days, whatever new inking projects I'm working on, or some collabs with some other artists that have done. The main one you'll see to let you know you're in the right place. There's a time lapse video of a Storm Gambit mashup into one character that a Brazilian artist put together that I did the inks and colors for, and yeah, that'll let you know that you're in the right spot. But I'll talk on there about what I'm inking, why I chose those pages to ink for practice, what kind of tools I'm using. I'm very open and honest with the mistakes and screw ups that I make on there, because it's a learning process, right? I'm just trying to get back into art more seriously after not doing it for 2 decades. So I figure you're interested enough in seeing what the journey is like and the actual path, rather than just seeing perfectly finished work every single time, good place to hang out.
Okay, cool. We'll have a link to your Blue Sky then in the show notes, so please check that out. As for us,
Cool.
superherocinefiles.com is the website, Super Cinema Pod on the socials, which mostly is Blue Sky. We are technically still on Instagram and Threads and Facebook, but that's just mostly for posting up updates. If you want to follow me, most of the stuff is happening over on Blue Sky. Thanks so much for listening, and we'll talk to you next time. Thanks for listening to the Superhero Cinephiles podcast. Superhero Cinephiles is produced by me, Percival Constantine. The show is created by myself and the late great Derek Ferguson, our host emeritus. Visit us on the web at superherocinephiles.com to listen to past episodes or find out how you can be a guest yourself. Support the show by visiting our advertiser links or click the Buy Me a Coffee link on the website to make a one-time donation. We are Super Cinema Pod on both Instagram and Blue Sky, so please be sure to follow us. We'd also appreciate it if you could rate and review the show on Apple Podcasts and share us with your friends.
Thank you for listening. And as always, good night, good evening. God bless.